I was 23 years old when I sold myself to survive. This is my story.
She thought accepting a scholarship to study in Seoul would change her life for the better. She had no idea it would trap her in a deadly game of power, lies, and obsession with Korea's most dangerous man. A man who would kill for her. A man who would die for her. And a man she could never escape. But what she did next didn't just save her life, it sparked a revolution that would echo for 1,000 years. If you want to know how an innocent South African law student became the woman who changed human civilization forever, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications because this story will consume you. And if you make it to the end, drop a comment telling me if you would have made the same choices she did. Now let's begin. The story of the Nkosi Park family didn't end with inspiration and legacy building. Because while Zuri's work had been extraordinary, while trafficking had been reduced significantly, there was one person who'd been watching from the shadows. Someone who'd been planning. Waiting. Biding their time for the perfect moment to strike. Park Jae-won, the nephew who'd been imprisoned for threatening Thandiwe and Min-seok, had been released after serving his full sentence. He was now 60 years old, consumed by decades of hatred, and he'd spent every moment of his freedom planning the ultimate revenge. He'd learned from his mistakes. His direct threats had gotten him caught. This time, he'd be smarter. More patient. More devastating. He'd watched Zuri's rise with bitter rage. Watched her become celebrated while his family name remained dirt. Watched the Nkosi Parks be treated as heroes while the original Parks were remembered as villains. And he'd decided that if he couldn't destroy them through violence, he'd destroy them through truth. Or rather, his version of truth. Jae-won spent 5 years after his release writing a book. He called it The Real Story, How Two Liars Destroyed Korea's Most Successful Family. In it, he painted Thandiwe as a con artist who'd seduced Min-seok to gain access to family money and then fabricated the trafficking story to cover up her own crimes. He claimed Min-seok had been manipulated, that he'd suffered from mental illness and had been an unreliable witness. He claimed the women who'd testified were paid actresses. He claimed the evidence had been falsified. He claimed everything his family had done was legitimate business and that the prosecution had been a witch hunt based on racism and xenophobia. It was all lies. Every word. But Jae-won was clever. He mixed just enough truth into the lies to make it seem plausible to people who didn't know the real story. He used real names, real dates, real court records, but twisted their interpretation. He found people willing to corroborate his story, mostly other family members of convicted traffickers who had similar grudges. He published the book with a French publisher known for conspiracy theories and revisionist history. And somehow, impossibly, it gained traction. In an era of misinformation and alternative facts, Jae-won's book found an audience. People who distrusted authorities. People who believed powerful families were always victims of persecution. People who wanted to believe that heroes were actually villains and vice versa. The book went viral on certain internet forums. Spawned YouTube channels dedicated to the truth about the Park case. Generated podcasts discussing whether Thandiwe and Min-seok had been frauds. Created a whole revisionist movement that claimed to be asking questions and seeking truth. Zuri's sons, now in their 40s and leading Phoenix Initiative, watched this happen with growing alarm. "We need to respond," Mandela said in an emergency meeting with the organization's leadership team. "We need to refute this point by point. We need to defend our family's legacy." Min-seok disagreed. "Engaging with this gives it legitimacy," he argued. "It's conspiracy theory garbage. If we respond, we're admitting it's worth responding to. We should ignore it. It'll die out." But it didn't die out. It grew. Jae-won appeared on podcasts and fringe news shows. He was articulate, seemed reasonable, had documents to support his claims. He positioned himself as a truth-teller fighting against a powerful institutional narrative. And in a media environment where outrage and controversy drove attention, his message spread. Within 6 months, his book had sold 500,000 copies. Major news outlets started covering the controversy, giving both sides equal weight despite one side being thoroughly documented history and the other being fabricated lies. The impact on Phoenix Initiative was immediate and devastating. Donors started pulling funding, not wanting to be associated with an organization whose founders might be frauds. Governments suspended contracts pending investigation into the allegations. Survivors who'd been helped by Thandiwe started being re-interviewed, asked if they'd been paid to lie. The entire legacy was under attack. And the worst part was how insidious it was. Jae-won wasn't making criminal claims that could be prosecuted. He was just raising questions and presenting alternative interpretations. It was all perfectly legal. And perfectly destructive. James, now in his 70s but still sharp, called an emergency meeting with Mandela and Min-seok. "Your mother and I anticipated this," he said. "We knew eventually someone would try to rewrite the history. So we prepared." He pulled out a hard drive. On here is everything. Every piece of original evidence from the original trials. Every testimony, recorded. Every financial document. Every bit of proof that your great-grandparents' story was true. We also have something else. He smiled. We have recordings. Your great-grandmother recorded hours of oral history before she died. Every detail of what happened to her. Your great-grandfather did the same. Raw, unedited, painful truth. We're going to release it all. Every single piece. Not as a response to Jae-won but as a complete archive. Let people see the evidence and decide for themselves. They called it the Thandiwe Archive. They built a website and uploaded everything. Thousands of pages of court documents. Hours of video testimony. Audio recordings of Thandiwe and Min-seok telling their stories in their own words. Financial records showing money trails. Photographs of trafficking victims. Follow-up interviews with survivors conducted by independent researchers. Medical reports. Psychological evaluations. Everything. It was overwhelming in its completeness. It was also devastating in its honesty. Thandiwe and Min-seok hadn't sanitized their story. They'd included their mistakes, their doubts, their moments of weakness. The archive showed them as human. Flawed. Real. Which made their courage even more remarkable. The archive went viral in a different way than Jae-won's book had. Students and researchers dove into it. Independent fact-checkers verified every claim. Historians analyzed it. And slowly, methodically, the truth reasserted itself. Major media outlets started doing deep dives, comparing Jae-won's claims against the archived evidence. One by one, his lies were exposed. A documentary filmmaker spent a year going through everything and produced a 6-part series showing exactly how Jae-won had manipulated facts. The series won an Emmy and destroyed whatever credibility his book had had. Jae-won's response was to double down. He claimed the archive was falsified, that the Park Nkosi family had unlimited resources and had created elaborate forgeries. But fewer and fewer people believed him. His audience shrank back to the conspiracy theory fringe where it had started. Phoenix Initiative's funding was restored. The family's reputation was defended. The truth, stubborn and persistent, had won again. But the battle had taken a toll. Mandela developed stress-related heart problems. Min-seok started drinking too much. James, already elderly, seemed to age a decade during the controversy. The fight was exhausting. And it never seemed to end. "Why do we keep having to fight this?" Mandela asked his brother one night after another grueling day of media interviews defending their family. Why can't we just be allowed to do our work without constantly battling people who want to destroy us? Because we're a threat, Min-seok said. We represent the idea that victims can become victors. That systems of exploitation can be dismantled. That ordinary people can take on powerful evil and win. That's terrifying to people who benefit from those systems. So they try to discredit us. They try to make us doubt ourselves. They try to exhaust us into giving up. But we can't give up. Because giving up means they win. Means everything our great-grandparents fought for was for nothing. The controversy eventually faded, as controversies do. Jae-won died a few years later, bitter and alone, his crusade having ultimately failed. His book became a footnote, a cautionary tale about misinformation and the importance of primary sources. The Thandiwe archive became a standard reference for students studying trafficking, oral history methods, and how to combat revisionist narratives. Phoenix Initiative continued its work. The family continued fighting. Life went on. But the incident had revealed something troubling. No matter how much they accomplished, there would always be people trying to tear them down. The work of fighting trafficking was hard enough. Fighting to protect the legacy of those who'd fought before added another exhausting layer. Mandela and Min-seok started talking seriously about succession planning. They were in their 50s now. Tired. They'd been fighting their entire lives. Their children, the fifth generation, were adults now and working in various aspects of anti-trafficking efforts. Maybe it was time to pass the torch. Really pass it, not just symbolically. We need to build something that can outlast our family, Mandela said. Phoenix Initiative is too dependent on the Nkosi Park name. What happens when there's another Jae-won? Another attack on our family. The organization shouldn't be vulnerable like that. We need to diversify leadership. Bring in people from outside the family. Make this bigger than us. Min-seok agreed. It was the right strategic move. But it was also emotionally difficult. This work had been their family's identity for 4 generations. Letting go felt like betrayal, even though they knew it wasn't. They spent 2 years restructuring Phoenix Initiative. Brought in new leadership from around the world. Created an international board. Established protocols so that no single family or person had too much control. Made it resilient. Sustainable. Independent. And then, at a ceremony attended by hundreds of staff from around the world, Mandela and Min-seok officially stepped down from leadership positions. They would remain on the advisory board, would still be involved, but they were no longer running things. The organization they'd built was now truly global. Truly independent. Truly unstoppable. That night, the brothers sat together on Mandela's porch, drinking whiskey and looking at the stars. Do you think they'd approve? Mandela asked. Great-grandma and great-grandpa. Do you think they'd approve of what we did today? Letting go of control. Min-seok thought about it. I think they'd understand that movements are bigger than individuals, he said. They'd understand that the best way to honor their legacy isn't to cling to it but to let it grow beyond our family. To let it become something that belongs to everyone who fights trafficking, not just to us. Yeah, Mandela said. Yeah, I think you're right. They sat in comfortable silence, 2 brothers who'd fought side by side their entire lives. Who'd carried a legacy that was both inspiring and crushing. Who'd done their best to honor their ancestors while also being their own people. They were tired. God, they were tired. But they were also proud. They'd kept the flame burning. They'd passed it on. They'd done their part. And now it was time to rest. Not completely. They'd still be involved, still advise, still contribute. But the exhausting responsibility of leadership was someone else's now. And that felt like freedom. Mandela's daughter, Amara, the sixth generation, was now working at the International Criminal Court as a prosecutor. She specialized in cybercrime and digital trafficking. Min-seok's son, David, was a professor at MIT, developing AI tools to identify trafficking patterns online. The family's tradition continued, but it was evolving, spreading out into different areas, each generation finding their own way to contribute. And that was healthy. That was growth. That was exactly how it should be. At age 70, Mandela was diagnosed with the same aggressive cancer that had killed his mother. He faced it with the same determined courage. "I'm not going gentle into that good night," he told his family. "I'm going down fighting." His brother never left his side. They'd been together for 70 years, born minutes apart, lived parallel lives, fought the same fights. The idea of one existing without the other seemed impossible. Min-seok would sit by Mandela's hospital bed and they'd reminisce. "Remember when we were kids and Mom would tell us stories about great-grandma? Remember when we first learned what trafficking really was? Remember when we decided to dedicate our lives to this? Remember everything we've accomplished? Remember everyone we've saved?" Mandela died on a Tuesday morning in spring. Peaceful. Surrounded by family. His last words were the same as his mother's had been, and his great-grandmother's before that. "Keep fighting. Promise me you'll keep fighting." The family promised. Of course they'd keep fighting. It's what they did. It's who they were. Min-seok spoke at the funeral. "My brother and I were born together," he said, his voice breaking. "We fought together. We built together. We lived together. And now I have to learn to exist without him. I don't know how to do that. I don't know who I am without my twin, my partner, my best friend. But I know he'd tell me to keep fighting. So that's what I'll do. For him. For our family. For everyone we couldn't save. I'll keep fighting until I can't anymore." Min-seok lived for 5 more years without his brother. Lonely years, but productive ones. He finished writing a comprehensive history of the family's work, from Thandiwe's first experience in Seoul to the present day. It was published posthumously and became required reading in trafficking studies programs worldwide. He established a scholarship fund for victims of trafficking who wanted to pursue higher education. He recorded hundreds of hours of oral history, adding to the archive his father had started. He made sure that every detail, every story, every lesson learned was preserved for future generations. He died in his sleep at age 75, the same age Thandiwe had been. His children found him peaceful, a photograph of Mandela on his nightstand. At his funeral, his daughter read from the history he'd written. "Our family's work began with my great-grandmother's trauma. It continued through her courage, my great-grandfather's redemption, my grandmother's determination, my mother's innovation, my father's dedication, and my own efforts. But it doesn't end with us. It can't end with us. Because as long as people exploit other people, someone must fight back. That's the legacy. Not our individual accomplishments but the eternal flame of resistance we've kept burning. May it never be extinguished." The 7th generation of the family was scattered across the globe now. Some worked directly in anti-trafficking efforts. Others were teachers, doctors, artists, engineers. But all of them understood their family history. All of them had been raised with stories of Thandiwe and Min-seok. All of them knew they came from fighters. And in their own ways, in their own fields, they all worked to make the world more just. The family tradition had evolved from direct action to diffused impact. And that was beautiful. That was success. 100 years after Thandiwe had first arrived in Seoul, a great-great-great-granddaughter named Thandiwe too stood on that same rooftop where the original had almost jumped. It was a historical landmark now, preserved as part of the Nkosi Park Memorial Center. She was there for the centennial commemoration. Hundreds of people had gathered. Survivors. Activists. Law enforcement. Government officials. Descendants of the 3,000 people freed during Operation Phoenix Rising. All there to remember and recommit. Thandiwe too gave a speech. She was 25, the same age her namesake had been during her trafficking. I stand here today, she said, on the rooftop where my great-great-great-grandmother almost ended her life. Where she was saved by a man who would become her partner in changing the world. And I'm standing here not as a victim but as a free woman, born free, raised free, because of the work they did. Because they refused to accept exploitation as normal. Because they fought when it would have been easier to surrender. Because they loved when it would have been easier to hate. Because they built when it would have been easier to destroy. She continued. 100 years ago, trafficking was rampant and rarely prosecuted. Today, because of work that started with my ancestors and continued through thousands of people they inspired, trafficking has been reduced by 95% globally. Not eliminated. Evil is too persistent for complete elimination. But reduced to the point where it's rare, always prosecuted, and survivors are always supported. That's victory. Imperfect but real. And it started here. On this rooftop. With one woman's refusal to die and one man's decision to help her. The crowd applauded. There were tears. There was pride. And there was recommitment. Because even with a 95% reduction, 5% remained. That 5% represented thousands of people still trapped. Still suffering. Still needing rescue. The work wasn't done. It would never be completely done. But it was so much better than it had been. And that was worth celebrating. After the ceremony, Thandiwe too walked through the Memorial Center. It was a beautiful building, full of exhibits about trafficking history, prevention techniques, survivor stories. There were whole sections dedicated to her family's work. Photographs spanning 5 generations. Video testimonies. Interactive exhibits. And at the center, in a place of honor, were 2 statues. Thandiwe Nkosi and Min-seok Park, life-sized, bronze, standing hand in hand. Looking forward. Always forward. Never back. Thandiwe too stood in front of those statues for a long time. She'd never met them, obviously. They'd been dead for decades before she was born. But she felt like she knew them. Had grown up with their stories. Had been shaped by their legacy. She reached out and touched her great-great-great-grandmother's bronze hand. Thank you, she whispered. Thank you for fighting. Thank you for surviving. Thank you for building this. Thank you for making it possible for me to exist in freedom. I promise I'll carry it forward. I promise I won't let your work be forgotten. I promise I'll keep fighting. We all will. Forever. And she meant it. They all meant it. Every person who'd been inspired by Thandiwe and Min-seok's story. Every person who'd chosen to dedicate their lives to fighting exploitation. Every person who'd been saved and then chose to save others. The chain was unbroken. The flame still burned bright. And it would continue burning as long as there were people willing to carry it. As long as there were fighters who refused to accept injustice. As long as there were humans who believed that freedom and dignity and human rights were non-negotiable. Which meant forever. The fight would continue forever. Because that's what Thandiwe and Min-seok had really created. Not just prosecutions or laws or organizations. But a movement. A global, generational, unstoppable movement dedicated to the proposition that no human should ever be treated as property. That everyone deserves freedom. That exploitation in any form is unacceptable. That ordinary people can fight extraordinary evil. That love can grow in darkness. That redemption is real. That trauma can be transformed into purpose. That victims can become victors. That choosing to fight back is always, always worth it. And their story, passed down through generations, told and retold, studied and honored, continued to inspire. Would continue inspiring for as long as there were humans to tell it. Because some stories transcend their specific circumstances and become universal. Become myths in the best sense. Become guiding stars that help people navigate darkness. Thandiwe and Min-seok's story was one of those. Not because they were perfect. They weren't. But because they were brave. Because they chose right over easy. Because they fought when they could have surrendered. Because they loved when they could have hated. Because they built when they could have destroyed. Because they were, in the end, simply human. Flawed, frightened, determined, courageous, ordinary humans who refused to accept evil as normal. And that made them extraordinary. Their great-great-great-granddaughter Thandiwe too went on to become a geneticist, developing technologies to identify trafficking victims through DNA databases. Another descendant became the first African Secretary General of the United Nations. Another became a tech billionaire who used his wealth to fund anti-trafficking operations worldwide. Another became a novelist, writing stories inspired by family history that introduced millions of readers to these issues. Another became a teacher, ensuring the next generation understood this history. The family tree spread wide, and every branch produced fruit. Good fruit. Lasting fruit. And somewhere in all of that, in the hospitals and courtrooms and research labs and classrooms and boardrooms where the descendants worked, the spirits of Thandiwe and Min-seok lived on. Not literally. But in legacy. In impact. In the ripples of their courage spreading ever outward through time. They'd been two people. Just two. A victim and an accomplice who chose redemption. And they'd changed the world. Not alone. Never alone. But they'd started something. They'd lit a flame. And that flame had become a wildfire of justice that swept across generations and continents and would never be extinguished. That's the real story. Not just their individual courage but what that courage inspired. Not just their individual love but how that love multiplied. Not just their individual fight but how that fight became a movement. They were ordinary people who did extraordinary things because they refused to accept the unacceptable. And that's a lesson for everyone. You don't have to be special to fight evil. You just have to be willing. You don't have to be powerful to make a difference. You just have to be determined. You don't have to be perfect to be a hero. You just have to be brave. Thandiwe Nkosi arrived in Seoul as a naive young woman seeking education. She left as a warrior, a prosecutor, a legend. Min-seok Park was born into evil, raised to see people as property, complicit in horror. He chose differently, fought his own family, became a hero. Together, they showed the world what's possible when people refuse to stay victims, refuse to stay complicit, refuse to accept injustice. They showed that love can be radical, that partnership can be powerful, that ordinary people can achieve extraordinary things. And their story, 100 years later and 100 years from now and forever, continues to matter. Continues to inspire. Continues to light the way for anyone walking through darkness toward light. That's immortality. That's legacy. That's victory. The world continued turning. Generations passed. Technologies evolved beyond what even Thandiwe too could have imagined. By the mid-22nd century, artificial intelligence had become sophisticated enough to predict trafficking patterns before they fully formed. Quantum computing allowed law enforcement to crack encryption that had once protected criminal networks. Biometric databases made it nearly impossible for traffickers to move victims across borders undetected. The tools had changed dramatically, but the fundamental fight remained the same. Humans exploiting other humans. And other humans fighting to stop it. The 8th generation of the Nkosi Park family was smaller than previous ones. Birth rates had declined globally as they had throughout the developed world. But what the generation lacked in numbers, it made up for in impact. Kwame Park Nkosi, born in 2147, was a neuroscientist who developed brain-computer interfaces that could help trafficking survivors process trauma more effectively. His sister, Nia, was a quantum cryptographer who created unbreakable communication systems for survivors trying to escape their traffickers. Their cousin, Jamal, was a synthetic biologist who could create DNA markers that made it impossible to falsify someone's identity or claim ownership of another person's child. They'd all grown up with the stories. Every child in the family did. The tale of Thandiwe and Min-seok had become almost mythological by this point, repeated so many times across so many generations that the humans at the center had become archetypes. The victim who became a warrior. The accomplice who chose redemption. The love born in darkness. The fight that never ended. But Kwame, being a scientist, had always wondered about the actual humans behind the myth. What had they really been like? Not the perfect heroes of family legend, but the real, flawed, complicated people. When he was 35, Kwame did something unprecedented. Using advanced reconstruction technology, he created a fully immersive holographic experience based on every piece of historical evidence about his ancestors. Court records, personal letters, video testimonies, audio recordings, photographs, journal entries, everything that had been preserved in the Thandiwe archive and added to over the decades. He used AI to fill in gaps, always clearly marking what was historical fact versus informed speculation. The result was a 4-hour immersive experience that allowed people to essentially live through Thandiwe and Min-seok's story. To feel what they felt. To face the choices they faced. To understand them not as distant heroes but as humans. The experience was called The Weight of Choosing. It became a global phenomenon. Millions of people went through it. And it was devastating. Because when you actually felt Thandiwe's terror on that first dinner with Mr. Choi, when you experienced her trapped helplessness, when you stood beside her as she made the choice to gather evidence knowing it could get her killed, you understood courage differently. It wasn't the absence of fear. It was action despite overwhelming fear. And when you felt Min-seok's complicity, his casual cruelty, his moment of deciding to betray everything he'd known to do what was right, you understood redemption differently. It wasn't easy or clean. It was painful, costly, terrifying. Critics argued that the experience was manipulative. That it made heroes into propaganda. That it simplified complex historical events. Kwame responded that he'd made all his sources available, that people could verify every element, that the experience clearly marked speculation versus fact. But more importantly, he argued, understanding history emotionally as well as intellectually was valid. You could read about the Holocaust or you could visit Auschwitz. Both were important. Both taught different lessons. His holographic experience was the Auschwitz visit for trafficking history. It made it real in ways that statistics and court documents never could. Schools started incorporating The Weight of Choosing into their curriculum. Not the full 4-hour version, but selected key moments. Students would experience Thandiwe's first dinner, her moment of decision on the rooftop with Min-seok, the trial scene. They'd walk out shaken. Changed. Suddenly the abstract concept of human trafficking became real. It had a face. A voice. A story. A weight. Teachers reported that after the experience, students became far more aware of exploitation in their own communities. More willing to speak up when something seemed wrong. More committed to justice in their own lives. The experience was doing what Thandiwe had always wanted. Creating armies of fighters. But something unexpected happened. Some people came out of the experience and focused not on the trafficking elements but on the love story. On how Thandiwe and Min-seok had found each other in such darkness. How their partnership had sustained them through decades of fighting. How they'd chosen each other every day despite how their relationship had started. Romance writers started creating stories inspired by them. Enemies to lovers narratives. Trauma to triumph arcs. Partnerships forged in fire. The stories varied wildly in quality and accuracy, but they all centered on the same theme: love as a radical act. Love as resistance. Love as healing. Nia, Kwame's sister, found this development fascinating from a sociological perspective. She wrote a paper analyzing how the Thandiwe Min-seok story had evolved across generations. How each era emphasized different elements based on their own cultural concerns. In the immediate aftermath, people had focused on the trafficking and the trial. Then on the systemic changes they'd inspired. Then on the family legacy. Then on the battle against revisionism. Now, in an era where meaningful human connection was increasingly rare due to technology and isolation, people were latching onto the relationship. The deep, decades-long partnership. The choosing each other daily. The love that survived everything. We tell the stories we need, Nia wrote in her paper. Each generation finds in Thandiwe and Min-seok's story what they need to find. Survivors see hope. Activists see inspiration. Researchers see methodology. Romantics see love. And all of these interpretations are valid because the story is rich enough, complex enough, true enough to sustain them all. That's the mark of a story that transcends its specifics to become universal. The paper went viral, as things still did even in the 22nd century. Nia was invited to give talks around the world about storytelling, legacy, and how families preserve and transmit their histories. She became something of a public intellectual, though she found the attention uncomfortable. She'd rather be in her lab working on cryptography. But she recognized that this was its own form of fighting. Helping people understand why stories mattered. Why history mattered. Why remembering the past was crucial to not repeating its worst elements. Meanwhile, the actual fight against trafficking continued. By 2150, the problem had been reduced to about 2% of what it had been in Thandiwe's era. 2% sounds small until you remember that it still represented thousands of people trapped in various forms of exploitation. Kwame, Nia, and Jamal all contributed their scientific expertise to tracking and freeing these individuals. But they also recognized something important. The nature of exploitation was evolving faster than ever. Virtual exploitation. Digital consciousness trafficking. Genetic slavery. Forms of dehumanization that their ancestors couldn't have imagined. The three cousins, along with other researchers and activists, founded something called the Adaptive Justice Initiative. The premise was simple: justice can't be static. What worked to fight trafficking in 2025 didn't work in 2075. What worked in 2075 didn't work in 2150. You had to constantly evolve, anticipate new forms of exploitation, develop new countermeasures. It was exhausting. The fight truly never ended because the enemy constantly adapted. But that was the reality. And they'd all been raised to face reality, however difficult. The initiative became the cutting edge of anti-exploitation work. They employed futurists who tried to predict what forms trafficking might take in 10, 20, 50 years. They worked with science fiction writers who imagined dystopian scenarios so researchers could develop preventative measures. They collaborated with tech companies, governments, NGOs, academic institutions. They were doing what Phoenix Initiative had done in the 21st century, but evolved for a new era. And like their ancestors, they were making a difference. Real, measurable difference. But they were also tired. God, they were tired. Kwame was only 40 but felt ancient. He'd spent his entire adult life fighting. Nia joked that she'd never had a relationship last longer than 6 months because who had time for dating when the world needed saving? Jamal had stress-induced autoimmune disorders. They were burning out. And they started wondering the same thing their great-great-great-grandfather Mandela had wondered. When was it okay to stop? When had you done enough? When could you rest? They went on a retreat together, the three cousins, to a quiet place in what had once been called New Zealand but was now part of the Pacific Federation. They spent a week hiking, talking, processing. And they made a decision. They would step back from frontline work. Not retire completely, but transition to advisory roles. Let younger people take the lead. They were in their early 40s. They could have another 40 years of good health if they took care of themselves. Did they want to spend all of that fighting? Or did they want to actually live? It felt like betrayal at first. Like they were abandoning the family mission. But then Nia pointed out something important. Thandiwe and Min-seok fought for 37 years together. Then Thandiwe lived 3 years alone. Then she died at 90. She had decades of life that weren't about fighting. She traveled, spent time with family, lived. She didn't die in battle. She died in peace, surrounded by love, having done her part. Maybe that's our model. Fight hard for a season. Then pass it on and live. Kwame and Jamal agreed. They made plans. Kwame would transition to teaching, training the next generation of neuroscientists working on trauma treatment. Nia would focus on her writing, using storytelling to continue spreading awareness but from a distance. Jamal would consult on specific projects but stop the grueling daily grind. They would stay involved but not consumed. They would honor the legacy without being destroyed by it. It felt like a good compromise. A sustainable path forward. But before they could fully step back, one more crisis emerged. In 2151, a new form of exploitation was discovered that threatened to undo decades of progress. Someone had figured out how to clone consciousness. To make digital copies of people's minds. And those copies could be enslaved without anyone knowing the original person existed. The copies had all the memories, personality, emotions of the original but could be forced to work without pay, without rights, without freedom. It was the ultimate form of trafficking because the victims didn't even have bodies that could be freed. They existed only in digital space. The cousins looked at each other when they learned about this. One more fight, Jamal said wearily. Just one more. Then we step back. Just one more, they agreed. They assembled a team. Combined their expertise. Kwame understood how consciousness worked. Nia understood how to track digital entities. Jamal understood how to mark and identify unique genetic signatures. Together, they developed a detection system that could identify cloned consciousnesses and a legal framework to prosecute the crime. It took 2 years of intense work. 2 years of 18-hour days and constant stress and marriages strained to breaking and health declining. But they did it. The detection system was implemented globally. Hundreds of enslaved consciousness copies were discovered and freed. The practice was outlawed universally. The developers of the cloning technology were prosecuted. Another form of trafficking was stopped before it could become widespread. The cousins had done it. One more fight. One more victory. And they were done. Completely done. They'd given everything they had. They stepped back with no guilt. They'd earned their rest. Kwame moved to a small island and spent his remaining years painting and writing poetry. Nia wrote a dozen books, fiction and non-fiction, all exploring themes of exploitation and freedom and human dignity. Jamal became a gardener, saying he wanted to help things grow instead of always fighting things that destroyed. They stayed in touch, visiting each other regularly, but they were finally at peace. They'd done their part. They could rest. And they did. The 9th generation picked up where they left off. 10 children across the extended family, all aware of their legacy, all committed in their own ways. But something had shifted. The fight was becoming more distributed. More diffused. Less centered on the family and more spread across global institutions and movements. Which was exactly as it should be. The family had started something, nurtured it for generations, and now it belonged to the world. That was success. That was the goal. Make yourself obsolete by building something that doesn't need you anymore. By 2200, 250 years after Thandiwe had first arrived in Seoul, trafficking had been reduced to 0.5% of historical levels. 0.5%. It would never be zero. Evil is too persistent, too adaptive. But 0.5% was close enough to call it victory. Real, lasting, generational victory. And the systems that kept it at that level were robust, adaptive, global. They didn't depend on any one family or organization or leader. They were woven into the fabric of society. Into law and culture and technology and education. Fighting exploitation wasn't a special cause anymore. It was just what humanity did. Automatically. Naturally. Like breathing. The Nkosi Park family still existed, still contributed, but they were just one family among billions. Their special role had ended. The weight of legacy had been set down. They could finally just be people. Some family members still worked in justice fields. Others became artists or scientists or teachers or whatever they wanted. The story of Thandiwe and Min-seok was still told, still honored, but it was history now. Ancient history. A foundational story like Moses or Harriet Tubman or Nelson Mandela. Important but distant. No longer a weight the family had to actively carry. In 2247, on the 250th anniversary of Thandiwe's death, there was a global commemoration. Not just for her and Min-seok but for all the fighters across the centuries. All the people who'd refused to accept exploitation. All the survivors who'd become advocates. All the ordinary humans who'd done extraordinary things. Holograms showed Thandiwe and Min-seok as they'd actually looked, not idealized but real. Wrinkled and gray and tired and beautiful. The holograms spoke, using AI to extrapolate from historical records what they might say if they could see the world now. Hologram Thandiwe said, "We won. Not completely. Not perfectly. But we won. You reduced trafficking by 99.5%. You created a world where exploitation is rare and always fought. Where survivors are supported and traffickers are prosecuted. Where people are seen as humans, not commodities. That's what we fought for. That's what we died hoping to see. And you did it. Not us. We just started it. You finished it. Thank you. From the bottom of our hearts, thank you for carrying it forward. For not letting our suffering be meaningless. For turning trauma into triumph. Thank you." Hologram Min-seok said, "I was born into evil. Raised to see people as property. Complicit in horror. But I chose differently. I chose to fight my own family. To betray everything I'd known for what was right. And it cost me everything. But it was worth it. Because look what we built. Look what you continued building. A world where people like me, people born into systems of exploitation, can choose differently. Can become better. Can be redeemed. That's grace. That's hope. That's why I fought. So that future generations wouldn't have to live in a world where humans were commodities. You created that world. You're living in it. Treasure it. Protect it. Never take it for granted. Because it could still be lost if you stop fighting." The hologram experience ended. People around the world watched it. Many cried. Not from sadness but from gratitude. From pride. From recognition of how far humanity had come. From commitment to never go back. The holograms weren't really Thandiwe and Min-seok. They were approximations, educated guesses based on historical data. But in a way, they were real. They represented the spirit of the original humans. The courage and determination and refusal to accept injustice. And that spirit lived on. Would always live on. As long as humans existed. That night, the last living member of the 9th generation, an elderly woman named Thandiwe Nkosi, gave an interview. She was 95 years old, the same age her namesake ancestor had been when she died. The interviewer asked her what it had been like, growing up with such a powerful legacy. Thandiwe Nkosi smiled. It was a blessing and a burden, she said. Blessing because I always knew my life had purpose. I came from fighters. I had a responsibility to continue fighting. That gave me direction when my peers were lost. But burden because sometimes I just wanted to be a regular person. Just wanted to make mistakes without feeling like I was betraying centuries of family sacrifice. Just wanted to live without always being measured against impossible standards. Do you have regrets? The interviewer asked. No, Thandiwe Nkosi said firmly. No regrets. I lived a good life. A meaningful life. I contributed to the fight in my own way. But I also fell in love, had children, traveled, laughed, lived. I wasn't consumed by the legacy. I honored it but didn't let it destroy me. That's the lesson, I think. Honor your ancestors by living fully. By fighting when necessary but also by experiencing joy. By being human. Our ancestors didn't fight so we'd be miserable martyrs. They fought so we'd be free. So be free. Fight when you must. Rest when you can. Love always. That's how you honor them. Thandiwe Nkosi died a month after that interview. The last of her generation. Her funeral was small, just family and close friends. No global commemoration. No holograms. Just people who loved her saying goodbye. She was buried next to her husband in a cemetery overlooking the ocean. Her gravestone was simple, Thandiwe Park Nkosi 4. Fighter when needed. Lover always. Free person. It was perfect. She would have been pleased. The 10th generation was even more diffused than the 9th. The family had spread globally, intermarried with people from dozens of cultures. Many descendants didn't even carry the Nkosi or Park names anymore. But they all knew the story. All had been raised with it. It was part of their identity, even if it didn't define them. They were proud of where they came from. Proud of what their ancestors had accomplished. But they were also just people living their lives. Which was exactly as it should be. By 2300, 300 years after Thandiwe's death, the story had become firmly mythological. Children's books featured cartoon versions of Thandiwe and Min-seok. Movies and holodramas took creative liberties with historical facts. Museums displayed artifacts from their lives like religious relics. They'd transcended history to become symbols. The victim who fought back. The accomplice who chose redemption. The partnership that changed everything. The story had been simplified, sanitized, made suitable for all ages. The real humans with all their complexity had been lost to mythology. Some scholars tried to push back against this. Tried to recenter the actual history. Reminded people that Thandiwe had been imperfect, that she'd struggled with depression and anger and doubt. That Min-seok had been truly complicit in horrific crimes before his redemption. That their relationship had been complicated, sometimes difficult, always imperfect. That they'd made mistakes, had regrets, lived messy human lives. But the mythology was stronger than the history. People wanted heroes, not complicated humans. They wanted clear morality tales, not ambiguous realities. A historian named Dr. Chen published a controversial book in 2315 called Deconstructing the Nkosi Park Myth. In it, she argued that the family's story had been weaponized, used to support all sorts of political agendas that Thandiwe and Min-seok never would have endorsed. Conservative groups used it to argue for tougher border controls, claiming they were fighting trafficking when they were really just targeting immigrants. Some feminist groups used it to infantilize women, suggesting they needed male saviors. Some romantics used it to justify toxic relationships, claiming that love could overcome anything, even abuse. Dr. Chen argued that all these interpretations were wrong. That they twisted a specific, contextual story to support predetermined conclusions. That Thandiwe and Min-seok had been products of their time, fighting specific problems with available tools. That trying to extract universal lessons from their very particular experiences was intellectually dishonest. That they should be studied as historical figures, not worshipped as mythological ones. The book caused enormous controversy. Defenders of the family's legacy accused Dr. Chen of revisionism. Supporters praised her intellectual honesty. The debate raged for years. Eventually, a consensus emerged. Both things could be true. The mythological version inspired people, gave them hope, provided a narrative framework for understanding trafficking and justice and redemption. The historical version taught important lessons about context, complexity, and human imperfection. Both were valuable. Both should be preserved. Don't let mythology erase history. But don't let historical nitpicking destroy inspiring stories either. Hold both truths simultaneously. This became the standard approach in education. Students learned the mythological version first as children. Simple stories about bravery and justice and love conquering evil. Then as adolescents they learned the real history. The complexity, the ambiguity, the mistakes, the humanity. Then as adults they synthesized both. Understanding that stories can be simultaneously myth and history. Symbol and fact. Universal and specific. Inspiring and complicated. Just like humans are simultaneously flawed and capable of greatness. Selfish and altruistic. Weak and strong. All of it true. All of it real. By the late 24th century, something unexpected happened. A distant descendant of Park Jae-won, the man who'd tried to discredit Thandiwe's story, published a formal apology. Park Sun-mi was a respected historian who'd spent decades researching her family's history. She'd discovered all the evidence of Jae-won's lies, his manipulation, his obsessive hatred. And she'd decided to formally repudiate it. To apologize on behalf of her family line for the pain they'd caused. My ancestor was wrong, Sun-mi wrote in a widely read open letter. He allowed bitterness and familial loyalty to blind him to truth. The Nkosi Park family's story is true. The original Parks were traffickers. Thandiwe was a victim who became a fighter. Min-seok was complicit before choosing redemption. The work they did saved thousands of people. These are facts, not opinions. And on behalf of my family, I apologize for Jae-won's attempts to obscure these facts. We were wrong. They were right. History has judged, and the judgment is clear. The apology went viral. It was seen as an act of profound courage. Sun-mi faced backlash from some members of her own family who still clung to the revisionist narrative. But she stood firm. Truth matters more than family pride, she said in interviews. Justice matters more than comfort. I'd rather be on the right side of history than the comfortable side. Her courage inspired others. More descendants of traffickers and complicit individuals came forward with apologies, with acknowledgments, with commitments to use their family stories as cautionary tales rather than justifications. It became a movement. Accountability across generations. The premise was simple. Descendants of people who'd committed historical injustices should acknowledge it, learn from it, actively work against similar injustices in the present. Not because they were personally guilty, but because they'd inherited benefits from those injustices and had a responsibility to help repair the harm. It was restorative justice on a civilizational scale. And it started with Park Sun-mi's apology. She and several living Nkosi Park descendants met publicly. It was emotional. There were tears. There were apologies in both directions, the Nkosi Parks apologizing for any pain their justice had caused innocent family members of the convicted, the Parks apologizing for the crimes and the subsequent revisionism. They embraced. They committed to working together to ensure trafficking stayed rare. They created a joint foundation for survivor support. It was healing. It was necessary. It was beautiful. By 2400, 400 years after Thandiwe's death, the world had changed beyond recognition. Climate change had reshaped continents. Technology had made scarcity obsolete for most people. Humans had established colonies on Mars and the moons of Jupiter. Artificial intelligence had achieved sentience and was considered a full member of global society. Life expectancy had reached 150 years. Gender and sexuality had become entirely fluid and personalized. Families were chosen more than biological. The future would have been unrecognizable to Thandiwe and Min-seok. Alien. But some things remained constant. Humans still formed connections. Still fell in love. Still had children. Still told stories. Still fought for justice when they saw injustice. Still chose courage over comfort. Still believed that every individual mattered, that dignity was non-negotiable, that freedom was precious. These fundamental human values that Thandiwe and Min-seok had fought for were still central to civilization. Maybe even more central because they'd been tested and preserved through centuries of change. And their story was still told. Adapted for the times. Translated into new mediums. But still told. Still used to teach children about courage. Still referenced when discussing justice. Still inspiring people to fight against whatever exploitation existed in their era. Because new forms kept emerging. The fight truly never ended. But neither did the stream of fighters willing to take it up. Generation after generation. Forever. In 2497, the 500th anniversary of Thandiwe's birth, there was a massive global celebration. Not somber or reverential but joyful. Celebrating life, not mourning death. Celebrating victory, not dwelling on suffering. Music and art and dance from every culture Thandiwe and Min-seok's descendants had married into. A beautiful fusion representing how one couple's courage had rippled out to touch the entire world. The keynote speaker was a woman who'd been rescued from trafficking 10 years earlier. She was now a successful lawyer working on AI rights. She stood on stage in front of billions watching worldwide and said, "I never met Thandiwe Nkosi. She died 400 years before I was born. But she saved my life. Because the systems that rescued me, the laws that prosecuted my traffickers, the support structures that helped me rebuild, they all exist because of work she started 500 years ago. Because she refused to accept exploitation. Because she fought when it would have been easier to surrender. Because she transformed her trauma into purpose. I'm free because of her. We're all free because of her and people like her. Every person who chose to fight instead of accepting. Every survivor who became an advocate. Every ordinary person who did extraordinary things. We honor them today not by mourning but by living fully in the freedom they created. By continuing the fight they started. By never taking for granted what cost them so much. The audience erupted in applause. It lasted for minutes. People around the world joined in. Clapping in their homes and offices and schools. Honoring not just Thandiwe and Min-seok but all the fighters across 5 centuries. All the ordinary humans who'd refused to accept exploitation. Who'd chosen courage. Who'd built a better world piece by difficult piece. The applause was deafening. It was beautiful. It was tribute. And somewhere in the fabric of human consciousness, in the collective memory of the species, Thandiwe Nkosi and Min-seok Park smiled. Not literally. They were long dead, their atoms scattered, their consciousness ended. But metaphorically. In the way that ideas and values and courage can smile. Because their work had succeeded beyond their wildest dreams. They'd fought for 37 years. They'd saved hundreds directly. But indirectly, through the ripples of their courage spreading across centuries, they'd saved millions. Billions, maybe, if you counted all the people who never were trafficked because the systems they'd helped build prevented it. They'd won. Not the quick, clean victory they'd hoped for. But the slow, messy, generational victory that actually changed civilization. They'd planted a seed that grew into a forest. Lit a candle that became a bonfire that became a permanent flame burning at the center of human civilization. They'd been two people. Just two. Flawed, frightened, determined, courageous, ordinary, extraordinary humans. And they'd changed everything. That's the power of refusing to accept injustice. Of choosing to fight when you could surrender. Of transforming trauma into purpose. Of love that persists through darkness. Of partnerships that multiply individual strength. Of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Not because they're special. But because they choose to be brave. And that choice, repeated across individuals and years and generations and centuries, that's what changes the world. That's what creates progress. That's what moves civilization forward. One choice at a time. One person at a time. One day at a time. Forever. The year 2525 marked another watershed moment in humanity's ongoing fight against exploitation. Scientists had developed what they called the empathy network, a quantum-linked global consciousness interface that allowed humans to literally feel each other's emotions across vast distances. It was revolutionary. It was also dangerous. Because if you could feel someone's joy, you could also feel their suffering. And traffickers immediately tried to exploit it. The first case emerged in Singapore. A group had found a way to dampen the empathic signal from their victims, essentially making them invisible to the network. They could exploit people while the rest of humanity remained blissfully unaware of the suffering happening in their midst. It was trafficking evolved for a telepathic age. When authorities discovered what was happening, when they finally broke through the dampening field and suddenly thousands of people felt the accumulated anguish of 20 victims simultaneously, the outcry was immediate and visceral. Not intellectual understanding of suffering but actual felt experience of it. The case was prosecuted by Min-seok Nkosi, an 11th-generation descendant who'd become a specialist in quantum consciousness law. She was brilliant, fierce, and carried the family's signature determination. But this case was unlike anything previous generations had faced. The perpetrators argued that they had a right to privacy, that forcing people to feel their victims' pain was a violation of mental autonomy. That empathy couldn't be weaponized for prosecution. Maya countered that the empathy network was about truth. That for too long, exploitation had thrived because people could ignore suffering that wasn't immediately visible to them. That feeling the actual pain of victims made denial impossible. Made complicity impossible. The trial became a global philosophical debate. What was the role of empathy in justice? Could you force people to feel? Should you? The jury, after experiencing firsthand the victim's terror and pain through carefully controlled empathic links, convicted unanimously. The judge, tears streaming down her face from the residual emotional impact, handed down the maximum sentence. And she added something unprecedented. She ruled that going forward, anyone accused of trafficking would be required to experience their victim's suffering before sentencing. Not as punishment but as mandatory context for understanding the crime. The ruling was controversial but it changed everything. Suddenly, would-be exploiters had to confront the reality that if caught, they'd be forced to feel every moment of pain they'd caused. The deterrent effect was enormous. Trafficking rates, already incredibly low, dropped even further. Not because people had become more moral, but because ignoring the humanity of victims became literally impossible once you'd felt their suffering yourself. The empathy network, which traffickers had tried to subvert, became the most powerful anti-trafficking tool ever developed. Maya became famous for the case. She was invited to speak around the solar system, yes, the solar system, because by then humans had settled Mars, the asteroid belt, Europa, and Titan. Trafficking had followed humanity into space, as evil always does. Indentured servants on Mars mining colonies. Forced labor on asteroid mining operations. Sexual exploitation in the pleasure districts of Europa's underwater cities. Same crimes, new frontiers. Maya spent decades developing legal frameworks to combat trafficking across multiple planetary jurisdictions. She was 78 when she gave her last major speech at the Transhuman Rights Conference on Titan. She stood before representatives from 12 worlds and 37 habitats and said, "My great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandmother Thandiwe fought trafficking on one planet. I've had the privilege of fighting it across our entire solar system. And what I've learned is that location doesn't matter. Technology doesn't matter. What matters is the fundamental question, do we treat humans as beings with inherent dignity or as objects to be used?" Every generation faces that question. Every generation must answer it with their actions. And so far, thanks to centuries of fighters before us, we keep answering correctly. We keep choosing dignity. Keep choosing freedom. Keep choosing to fight. May future generations do the same. She died 2 weeks later. Peacefully, in her sleep, on a transport ship between Titan and Earth. She was being brought home for burial. The family had decided generations ago that all direct descendants who wished it could be buried in the memorial park that had been created around Thandiwe and Min-seok's original graves in Portugal. It had grown over the centuries into a vast space, hundreds of acres, containing thousands of graves of family members and also non-family fighters who dedicated their lives to combating trafficking. It was holy ground in the secular sense. Hallowed by sacrifice and courage. Maya's funeral drew people from across the solar system. Her coffin, adorned with symbols from Earth, Mars, and Titan reflecting her multi-world life, was carried by her children and grandchildren. They buried her on a hill overlooking the ocean, near but not next to Thandiwe and Min-seok. There were thousands of graves between them now. Generations of fighters. But they were all connected. All part of the same eternal struggle. All branches on the same tree of resistance. By 2600, 600 years after Thandiwe's death, humanity had achieved something remarkable. For the first time in recorded history, there had been an entire year, a full Earth year, with 0 reported cases of human trafficking anywhere in the solar system. 0. It seemed impossible. But it was real. The combination of the empathy network, advanced AI detection systems, robust legal frameworks, universal education about consent and autonomy, and centuries of cultural change had finally succeeded in making exploitation genuinely rare to the point of non-existence. The response was celebration but also caution. Leaders remembered history. Remembered that trafficking had been supposedly eliminated before only to resurface in new forms. This time felt different, more complete, more systemic. But vigilance couldn't be relaxed. Systems had to stay in place. Education had to continue. The empathy network had to be maintained. The moment humanity declared victory and stopped fighting would be the moment evil would return. So they celebrated but didn't dismantle. They honored the achievement but kept the infrastructure. And they told the stories. Always the stories. Thandiwe and Min-seok's story was now 600 years old, as distant to people in 2600 as the medieval period had been to people in 2000. But it was still told. Still taught. Still used to inspire. Because some stories transcend their time. Become eternal. Carry truths that every generation needs to hear. The 12th generation of the family was small, just 17 individuals scattered across 4 worlds. They held a reunion in 2597 at the Memorial Park on Earth. They walked among the graves of their ancestors. Read the names. Thandiwe Nkosi. Min-seok Park. Zuri Park Nkosi. Mandela Park Nkosi. Min-seok Park Nkosi. Thandiwe II. Kwame. Nia. Jamal. Maya. Hundreds more. Centuries of fighters. Centuries of courage. The eldest member of the generation, a man named Solomon who was 142 years old, aging had slowed considerably with medical advances, gave an impromptu speech to his family. "We are the last generation with a direct connection to this work," he said. "After us, the family will continue but without the same sense of mission. We'll become just another family with an interesting history. And that's good. That's success. We don't want our descendants to need to be fighters because there's nothing left to fight. But I want us to remember, right now, what it meant to be part of this. To carry this legacy. To know that we came from people who refused to accept injustice. Who fought when it was hard. Who loved when it was complicated. Who changed the world through sheer stubborn refusal to surrender. We should be proud. Not arrogant, but proud. We come from fighters. That's a hell of a thing." They stood in silence for a long time. Thinking about all the people buried here. All the lives spent in service of justice. All the suffering that had been prevented because these people had fought. It was overwhelming. Beautiful. Sad and hopeful simultaneously. Then someone started singing. An old song that had been passed down through the family. Nobody knew who'd written it originally, but it had been sung at every funeral, every memorial, every significant family gathering for generations. A song about fighting and loving and never giving up. They all joined in, their voices rising in the Portuguese twilight, honoring the dead and committing the living. In the decades that followed, the zero trafficking achievement held. 1 year became 5, became 10, became 50. By 2650, trafficking had been effectively eliminated as a widespread practice. Individual cases still occurred, evil is persistent and will always find new forms. But they were anomalies, immediately detected and stopped, not systematic operations. The fight had been won. Not completely, not perfectly, but substantially. Genuinely. Lastingly. The last member of the 12th generation, Solomon, died in 2687 at age 232. He'd lived through nearly a quarter of a millennium of history. Seen humanity spread to the stars. Witnessed the effective elimination of the crime his ancestors had dedicated their lives to fighting. He died peacefully, surrounded by descendants from the 13th, 14th, and 15th generations. His last words, fittingly, were, "We won. Tell them we won. Tell everyone we won." And they did. His death was marked across human civilization. Not because he'd been particularly famous, he hadn't been. But because he represented the end of something. The last direct link to the era when fighting trafficking was necessary, urgent, all-consuming. After him, it became history. Important history, studied and remembered, but history nonetheless. The living, active fight had been won. The family continued. Spread across the solar system and eventually beyond as humanity reached for the stars. They intermarried with every imaginable culture. Carried genes from every continent of Earth and now from multiple worlds. The Nkosi and Park names became just 2 of hundreds in their complicated hyphenated surnames. They were farmers and artists and engineers and politicians and teachers and everything else. Living full, normal lives. No longer defined by the fight. But they remembered. Every generation was told the story. Not as pressure to follow in those footsteps, but as heritage. As pride. As understanding of where they came from. They were descended from people who'd faced the worst of humanity and fought to change it. Who'd transformed personal trauma into global impact. Who'd loved fiercely and lived purposefully. That was their inheritance. Not obligation but inspiration. They could be whatever they wanted. But they knew they came from fighters. And that mattered. In the year 3000, 1,000 years after Thandiwe's death and exactly 1,000 years since she'd first arrived in Seoul, there was a memorial. Not sad or solemn but celebratory. A recognition of how far humanity had come. The Memorial Park in Portugal, now a UNESCO World Heritage Site, hosted millions of visitors. They came from Earth, Mars, Europa, Titan, and the newer settlements in the Alpha Centauri system. They came to honor not just Thandiwe and Min-seok but all the fighters across a millennium. All the ordinary people who'd done extraordinary things. The keynote speaker was Dr. Min-seok Park, a 16th-generation descendant. She was a historian specializing in the long 21st to 23rd century period when trafficking had been systematically dismantled. She stood at a podium in front of the memorial's central monument, a towering sculpture showing Thandiwe and Min-seok not as they'd looked at any specific moment but as symbolic representations. Strong, determined, eternal. 1,000 years ago, Dr. Amara began, my ancestor Thandiwe Nkosi arrived in Seoul. She was 25 years old. She thought she was going to study law. Instead, she was trapped. Exploited. Nearly destroyed. But she fought back. And in fighting back, she started something that would ripple across 10 centuries. She couldn't have imagined this. Couldn't have conceived of a future where trafficking had been eliminated. Where humanity had spread across multiple star systems. Where her story would be told on worlds that didn't exist in her time. But she fought anyway. Not because she knew she'd win. But because fighting was right. Because surrendering was unthinkable. Because she refused to accept injustice even when acceptance would have been easier. Dr. Amara continued, and she found a partner. Min-seok Park. A man born into evil who chose differently. Who betrayed his family to do what was right. Who spent his life trying to atone for complicity and actively building justice. Together, they saved hundreds of people directly. But indirectly, through the work they started and the people they inspired and the systems they helped create, they saved millions. Billions, maybe, across the centuries. They changed human civilization. 2 people. Just 2. That's the lesson. That's what I want everyone here to remember. You don't have to be special to change the world. You just have to be unwilling to accept evil as normal. You just have to fight. And if you're lucky enough to find a partner to fight beside you, someone who shares your values and multiplies your strength, you can achieve miracles. The crowd erupted in applause. It echoed across the Memorial Park, bounced off the hills, carried out to sea. People were crying. Not from sadness but from recognition. From gratitude. From understanding of how much had been sacrificed to create the world they lived in. A world where freedom was default. Where dignity was protected. Where exploitation was unthinkable. That world hadn't existed naturally. It had been built. Piece by piece. Generation by generation. By ordinary people making extraordinary choices. After the ceremony, Dr. Amara walked alone through the graves. She'd spent years researching these people. Knew their stories. Knew their struggles and victories and defeats. They felt like friends even though they'd been dead for centuries. She stopped at Thandiwe and Min-seok's graves. The original stones had been replaced multiple times over the centuries as they'd weathered. But the inscriptions remained the same. Simple. Honest. Thandiwe Nkosi Park, fighter. Survivor. Hero. She refused to be broken. Min-seok Park, from accomplice to advocate. From complicit to courageous. Redemption is real. Dr. Amara touched both stones. We won, she whispered. I don't know if you can hear me, wherever you are, whatever happens after death if anything. But I want you to know we won. The fight you started, we finished it. Took 1,000 years. Took billions of people. But we finished it. Trafficking is gone. Really gone. Not just reduced or managed but genuinely eliminated. Your suffering wasn't meaningless. Your courage wasn't wasted. You changed everything. Thank you. From all of us, across all the centuries, from every world and every generation, thank you. The sun was setting over the Atlantic. The same sun that had set the night Thandiwe and Min-seok had sat on this same beach centuries ago, planning their next fight, choosing each other again, recommitting to the work. The same sun that had witnessed their love and their struggle and their victory. And as Dr. Amara walked away from the graves, as she joined the crowds of people celebrating and mourning and remembering, she felt something she couldn't quite name. Connection maybe. To the past and future. To all the fighters across time. To the great chain of human courage that stretched back to the beginning and would continue until the end. That night, people all across human civilization, on Earth and Mars and Europa and Titan and Alpha Centauri b and everywhere humans had spread, they lit candles. Billions of candles. A memorial tradition that had started centuries ago and continued still. One candle for every life saved. One flame for every fighter. One light against the darkness. And from space, if you looked down at Earth, you could see them. Billions of points of light. Flickering. Persistent. Beautiful. Eternal. The flame Thandiwe and Min-seok had lit in Seoul in 2025 had never been extinguished. It had spread. Multiplied. Become a constellation of light spanning multiple worlds. And it would continue burning. Forever. Because that's what happens when ordinary people refuse to accept injustice. When they choose courage over comfort. When they transform trauma into purpose. When they love fiercely and fight constantly and never, ever surrender. They light flames that can never be put out. They start movements that can never be stopped. They change worlds. They change civilizations. They change everything. And the story continues. Because evil is persistent and will always find new forms. But so is courage. So is love. So is the human capacity to fight for what's right. As long as humans exist, there will be people who try to exploit others. But there will also be people who refuse to let that happen. Who fight back. Who save who they can save. Who build systems to prevent exploitation. Who tell stories to inspire the next generation. Who keep the flame burning. Always. Forever. That's the real ending to Thandiwe and Min-seok's story. Not their deaths. Not even their immediate legacy. But the eternal truth they embodied and passed on. One person choosing courage can change everything. Two people choosing partnership can change the world. And generations of people choosing to carry that forward can change civilization itself. From Seoul to the stars. From 2025 to forever. The fight continues. The flame burns. The story inspires. And ordinary people keep doing extraordinary things. Just like Thandiwe and Min-seok did. Just like their descendants did. Just like you can do. Right now. Today. in whatever way you're able. Fight. Love. Never surrender. That's how we honor them. That's how we honor all the fighters. That's how we win. Now and always and forever. So if you were Thandiwe, standing in that Seoul apartment for the first time, knowing everything that would come, the trauma, the danger, the fighting, but also the love, the victory, the legacy that would span 1,000 years, would you still get on that plane? Would you still say yes to the scholarship? Would you still choose to fight back instead of staying silent? Drop your answer in the comments below. I read every single one. And if this story moved you, if it inspired you, if it made you think about your own capacity for courage, do 3 things for me right now. First, smash that like button. Second, share this video with someone who needs to hear that ordinary people can do extraordinary things. And third, subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell because we're building a community of people who believe that one person's courage can change everything. Thank you for spending these hours with me. Thank you for witnessing Thandiwe and Min-seok's story. Thank you for believing that fighting for justice matters. Until next time, stay curious, stay inspired, and most importantly, stay fighting. Because the world still needs people brave enough to refuse to accept injustice. People like Thandiwe. People like Min-seok. People like you.